Welcome back to The Sweat, and hello to the first time to our NBA panel. DraftKings contributors Matt Meiselman, Garion, Thorne, and Rotowire's Nick Whalen. Fellas, NBA building blocks time. Need your best DFS plays to build around for tonight's 6-game NBA slate, because we don't know what to do here. So who are you building around at center, Matt?
I'm going to start with Karl Anthony Towns. I think this slate overall is a little complicated at the moment. We have a ton of players currently listed questionable or game time decision with Trae Young, but the one team that we have some clarity on is Minnesota, where a couple guys in the backcourt are questionable, but for the most part, the main players on this team, we know they're going to be out there. And this is just a really, really good matchup for the Minnesota Timberwolves in Detroit against a Pistons team that doesn't defend especially well and doesn't really have the size to compete with Towns. So I just really like Towns in general. I think that more people will play Anthony Davis tonight. And for that reason, too, I think Towns makes for a really good tournament play.
All right, Garion, what's your strategy at center?
Yeah, I'm going to go down a little bit farther and sort of echo something that Matt was talking about, which is that you kind of have to take sure things at this point. And while the Heat might have the most question marks of any team currently, right now they have 4 rotation players, including Jimmy Butler and Kyle Lowry, listed as questionable tonight. Bam Adebayo is not listed as questionable, and he is coming off arguably his best game of the season. He had a massive double-double on Tuesday against the Raptors that included 32 points, a season high, 32 points. And this matchup really couldn't be better against the Spurs, considering both of their centers are in the concussion protocol currently. The most important of those two, obviously, being Jakob Poeltl. You know, there are maybe some ways that San Antonio can get creative with their center rotation. We'll get into that in a little bit. But right now, this is going to be an undersized interior for the Spurs. And I just think Bam Adebayo, particularly if Butler's out and Kyle Lowry plays, I think that is like the ideal situation for Bam Adebayo. And $8,400 is a pretty reasonable salary. So I think it's a nice starting point.
All right, Nick, do you feel like you got to go with a sure thing at center here?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's a few guys at the top, and if you don't go with one of those guys, all of a sudden you find yourself in like the 5,000 or 6,000 range, and you're far away from a sure thing at that point. So Karl Anthony Towns is kind of where I start as well. He's at 10,000. Detroit, of course, a bottom 5 defense over the last 10 games. They're a team that we've really been talking about targeting all season. It's a pace-up game for Detroit, a team that typically plays relatively slowly. Minnesota, number 1 in pace over the last 10 games. Towns leads all players on this slate in fantasy points per minute over his last 10. So there's a lot of reasons, I think, to shade your lineups toward Karl Anthony Towns tonight. I think I'd stay away from Anthony Davis on the back-to-back. He looked great last night. Of course, got to give him credit. But, he's had the wrist thing. He's Anthony Davis. He's always seemingly banged up. Second game of a back-to-back scares me a little bit. So I think I'm going to back off of Davis. But I like the Adebayo call as well. 8,400, I think, is a really good price. He also is coming off of one of his better games, not just since he's returned, but one of his better games of the season. And like Garion said, I mean, we're to the point that we could very well see, and most likely will see, Drew Eubanks starting at center for the Spurs, which I'm gonna take Adebayo on that side of the matchup.
Gary, which forward is a must-play? Looks like Jimmy Butler, questionable, is the highest-priced guy in this department with a toe injury.
The toe.
Power forward is really interesting tonight, just in the way the pricing breaks down. So forward's kind of an interesting position on this slate, especially with all the questionable guys. Maybe one of the reasons I didn't mention Karl Anthony Towns in the first question, I just like Anthony Edwards. I think you might be getting him, even though this is an obvious good spot for anyone on the Timberwolves. I mean, the Wolves just bring the pace. They are the highest paced team in the NBA across their last 10 games. We all know Detroit cannot defend. This is a good spot. There's a reason why the Timberwolves have the second highest implied team total on tonight's slate. But maybe a couple people are scared away from Edwards just because of the variance. I mean, he's had 2 really poor performances in his last 2 games, although I think it's worth noting that the last game was sort of out of his hands. It was just Nikola Jokic went to the bench and Minnesota destroyed Denver's awful bench unit. And by the time that had happened, there was really no need for Minnesota's starters to come back in. So I don't really hold that particular game against Edwards. I just think it was a weird script thing. But this is someone who, even with 2 underwhelming performances in his last 5 games, he's also scored 60 DraftKings points twice in his last 5 games. So the upside is obvious. I think he's in a position to thrive tonight against a Detroit team that just doesn't have anyone to stop him. So hopefully the variance scares a couple people away, but I really like Edwards.
Nick, who's in a position to thrive tonight at forward?
I'm going to keep going back to Pascal Siakam, and his salary keeps climbing. He's at 9,000, but he's very viable tonight against the Bulls defense that, was really good earlier in the season, and now that it's lost some of its point of attack defenders, just has not been very good over the last couple of weeks. Bulls are 24th in defense over the last 10 games. They're a lot more vulnerable than they were earlier in the season. And, not only is Siakam playing really well, some of the best basketball all around of his career, but he's still playing close to, if not more than, 40 minutes every single night. I mean, he got a break and only played 35 minutes in their last game against Miami, and that kind of feels like his floor. That's the worst case scenario if you're putting him in your lineup and he only plays 35 minutes. So I think it's a great thing when you can say that about any player. You're expecting him to basically play 40 minutes. So I love Siakam tonight. And then Mikal Bridges, another player who I kind of keep waiting for his minutes to normalize, but it just has not happened. He's played 40 plus now in 4 straight games. Suns are at Atlanta tonight. I think it's an intriguing matchup, certainly if Trae Young plays. If not, I really like Phoenix's chances here. But Bridges coming off of 2 big scoring games, and it kind of feels to me like Phoenix knows the run that they're on, and they want to keep pushing this thing. Like, there's really been no reason why Booker, Paul, Bridges, these guys are all playing like 38 to 42 minutes every single night. I think they realize, like, hey, we have kind of a special streak going, and we want to keep pushing it. So I think 6,400, a really good deal for a player who's a virtual lock, to keep seeing minutes close to 40.
Matty, which forward are you going to consider building your lineups around?
Yeah, so I like the call of targeting Raptors against the Bulls. I think the Bulls defense is kind of a thing that a lot of people are missing. So I'm on the same page there. But there's another team that struggles defensively that I want to target too. And the players here might be a little less popular, and that's the LA versus LA game. Marcus Morris was away from the team for a while for the Clippers. He's been back 2 games now. The minutes are coming up a little bit, and the price has dropped. He was in the mid 6,000s. Now he's down to 5,700. So I think we have a chance to get a buy low spot on Marcus Morris where he's the main guy on this offense, maybe him or Reggie Jackson. But Marcus Morris takes a lot more shots in a situation where Kawhi Leonard and then Paul George are out for extended periods of time. The offense runs through him a lot of the time. The Lakers are also on a back-to-back tonight. They just played Portland. The defense might be a little more sluggish than normal. So I think we're getting a little bit of value on Morris, and I think the matchup might be a little better than people realize.
Hey, Nick, is there a guard you feel you can build around?
Yeah, the 3 guys that I really found myself gravitating toward this morning were Fred VanVleet at 8,800, Chris Paul at 9,700, and Devin Booker at 9,300. So, if you want, you could kind of shoehorn those 3 guys into a lineup. You probably have to pick 2. I think I would lean VanVleet and Chris Paul. Booker and Paul have been incredible during this Suns' latest winning streak. Suns have the best offense in the league by a mile during the streak. Both of them have played super well pretty much every single night. This should be a good matchup against the Hawks, assuming Trae Young plays. Should be a fairly competitive game. So those 3 are where I would start. It should be noted, of course, that DeJounte Murray would normally be just an auto, lineup guy for me, but he is questionable for this game. So TDB, we'll see how that turns out throughout the day. And I also think Steph Curry, if you do feel like really paying up at 10,400, he's in another very good spot, catching the Kings on the second night of a back-to-back. Had that big game against Houston. I'm still not totally convinced that Curry has snapped out of that extended slump, but you really can't ask for 2 better back-to-back matchups to break out of something like that than Houston and Sacramento.
Matt, what do you think? Which guard is catching your eye?
So I want to stick with the Spurs because I do think DeJounte Murray is more likely to sit than to play. The Spurs are on a back-to-back. They just came off this tough loss against the Warriors, and they play tomorrow against the Houston Rockets. So for tonight's game with Murray questionable, I think I'm leaning in the direction of him being out, and that leaves Derek White. I guess White could sit also. He's been resting at times when Murray sits, but assuming White plays at $6,000, he's the guy who runs the offense from the backcourt. This should be a more up-tempo game for the Spurs than usual, too, because they don't have their defense-first center in Jakob Poeltl playing. Drew Eubanks is the likely starter, but this could be a game where the Spurs have to go small. The pace could pick up. So White obviously has more responsibility if Murray's not there, but I also think this game could be different than it normally is for San Antonio.
All right, Garion, which guard are you rolling with?
Yeah, I'm in lockstep with Nick. I think the 2 guys I had written down were Fred VanVleet and Chris Paul. I think Paul is interesting, and this is something Matt talks about a lot, generally as it pertains to totals with the Hawks. But, I think the presence of Trae Young does a lot for me in terms of Devin Booker and Chris Paul's value, because if he's playing, the likelihood of a more tight game script is obviously improved. I mean, Trae Young's a very, very talented offensive player. He also pushes the pace for Atlanta, and he's a terrible defender. So I just think their offensive fortunes improve if Trae Young is playing. So it's kind of funny to think of an Atlanta Hawks player dictating my feelings towards a pair of Phoenix Suns, but I think that is a little bit of the case where Van Vliet's just solid. I mean, on a slate with so many question marks, I am really drawn towards just the sheer floor of the Raptors, like quote-unquote star players. Van Vliet, across his last 6 games, leads the NBA, 42.2 minutes per game. He's one of 3 players averaging over 100 touches per game. He's just going to play 40 minutes. Like, Nick was joking earlier that Pascal Siakam only played 35 minutes. He got a break. The only reason that happened is he picked up 2 quick fouls in the first quarter and had to sit for 9 minutes, which is unprecedented for a Raptor right now. So it really does take, like, an act of God to stop one of these guys from reaching 40 minutes, and I just think they're going to play 40 again tonight.
Matt, how do you feel about taking the route of starting your roster construction and building around a value play?
So I like building around a value play. I think I kind of want to leave one for the end of the night. The low-key injury, so we mentioned a bunch of big names that may not play tonight. The more under-the-radar one, I think, is Ivica Zubac, where in the Clippers game, if he doesn't play, you get probably 2 guys that split the center minutes between Serge Ibaka and Isaiah Hartenstein. I don't think the Clippers can really go small here because the Lakers have Anthony Davis now. It would be a different thing if we had the LeBron center lineups the Lakers were running for a while. But with Davis and Dwight Howard, I think the Clippers do want to play a center. So to me, I think you save a spot in your lineup for either Serge Ibaka or Isaiah Hartenstein. Both are priced in the 3,000s. I probably lean towards Ibaka, but these are 2 cheap guys who, if Zubac doesn't play, you get a lot of potential value from a slot at the end of the night where most people have probably taken out value plays elsewhere. This is a 10 o'clock game. It's the last one, the lock of the entire slate. So I really like the idea of saving a spot for one of those 2 centers.
Garion, a lot of value plays here in your DK Nation article. Would you consider building around one of them?
Yeah, I think one that I sort of brought up towards the end of that article, it just keeps becoming more appealing to me, although he'll have to be activated is what we kind of have to look out for here. But I kept kind of looking at that Spurs center rotation being like, oh, God, like Drew Eubanks, I don't really feel like playing him. Are they going to activate Thad Young? I don't know. Like, that's weird. Zach Collins, man, why wouldn't they activate Zach Collins for this game? I mean, he's in form. Like, this is someone who is playing with the Austin Spurs. He played 27 minutes in a game on the 29th. He played 29 minutes on a game on the 31st. And that first game I was talking about, he went off for 15 points and 18 rebounds. Like, Zach Collins constantly injured. I know you want to be very careful with him, but this isn't one of those situations where if he's activated, we have to say, like, oh, he hasn't played in like a year and a half. He might be limited to 15 minutes. His conditioning is fine. He's out there playing. So I think if he gets the call tonight, there's a realistic probability that he plays somewhere between 25 to 35 minutes for a Spurs team that just does not have anyone else. And Collins is at least talented when he's healthy. So I would really keep an eye on that news.
All right, Nick, building around a value play. Is that a strategy you like tonight?
It is, and Matt, kind of stole my Serge Ibaka value play. I think that's the way to go. If Zubac does not play, of course, like Matt said, you have to wait till later in the night. So maybe some people don't want to take that risk. But I mean, Ibaka played 22 minutes against Indiana on Monday, 14 points, 11 rebounds, 2 blocks, and a steal. And again, if Zubac doesn't play, I mean, he's probably locked into at least 22 minutes, if not more. Essentially splitting that time with Hartenstein. I like Keldon Johnson as well in San Antonio. Not a massive value. He's at 5,700, but he's played 35-plus minutes in 4 straight games. Spurs, as we keep saying, are down a few guys. They'll likely be without Doug McDermott tonight as well. So I think that workload continues for Keldon Johnson. And then one other guy that I would highlight is Javonte Green in Chicago. And, of course, with Javonte Green, you're not looking at a ton of upside, but he plays a consistent role. They need his size. They need his athleticism to defend on the wing, especially against a team like Toronto. And he has 20-plus DraftKings points in 3 of his last 4.
All right, finally, fellas, let's switch gears and look at the DK Sportsbook here. So which matchup features the best bets out there today? What do you think, Garion?
So I was a little thrown off by the over-under in the Raptors-Bulls game. I'm just really used to seeing Raptors games in the mid-2 teens, and this is at 225.5. They have been hitting the over quite a bit when playing in Toronto with no fans. I know there was a lot of like study put into that during the bubble and how that does affect the over and shooting percentages. But in general, the Raptors are a team just built to hit unders. I mean, across their last 10 games, they have a top 10 defensive rating, and they have the slowest pace in the NBA. They're averaging under 95 possessions per 48 minutes. The Bulls are a talented offensive team. Their defense has been leaky the last couple weeks, but I still think this is a really big number for a Raptors game. So I'm just going to take the under, considering it's hit 9 of their last 13 contests.
Nick, what do you think? Which matchup features the best bets out there?
Yeah, I like the under in the Lakers-Clippers game. 219.5 is the number there. We'll see if that moves throughout the day. And I also like the Suns to cover 4.5 at Atlanta. Whether Trae Young plays or not, that probably affects the line. But I think I would take Phoenix no matter what. Atlanta just 13-13 against the spread at home. They're 7-13 against the spread as an underdog. Just 1-3 against the spread as a home underdog this season. Meanwhile, Phoenix 15-8 against the spread on the road and 12-6 against the spread as a road favorite. So a lot of reasons to think that the Suns keep it rolling.
All right, what do you think, Matt?
So a lot of uncertainty with a lot of different injuries. I'll stick with the game that Garion mentioned, which is one of the few where we actually know who's playing, at least with some level of certainty for both teams. I'm just going to pick the Raptors to cover. I've been anti-Bulls for a few weeks now. I really think that those Alex Caruso and Lonzo Ball injuries are just being dramatically overlooked. And if this Bulls team had to play a full season without those two guys, I don't think they even get in the playoffs. Like, this is a team that can look really good on a once in a while basis, because they do have the high volume shooters, and LaVine and DeRozan can get hot in any given game. But overall, this is not that efficient of an offense. It's an okay one, and it's a really bad defense. And I think the Raptors are a good team. So even though they don't have any fans out there to cheer them on, the Bulls still do have to travel to Toronto to play there. Maybe that's where Toronto's getting their home court advantage from, just because people have to fly to Canada. So I still like the Raptors to cover. It's up to -3.5, but I think it should be a lot higher.